Good afternoon. My name is Camille Fesche, a graduate of the Johns Hopkins University Krieger School of Arts and Sciences, class of 2002, and I'm an attorney and co-chair of the Government and Relations Lobbying Division of Rifkin Livingston, LLC. It is my pleasure, and I'm very excited to join you as a moderator for today's book talk with fellow Johns Hopkins alum, Leo Wise. His new book, Who Speaks for You? The inside story of the prosecutor who took down Baltimore's most crooked cops, sheds new light on the unique aspects of the shocking case following the arrest of the Baltimore Police Department's Gun Trace Task Force in 2017. Wise's discussion of the decisions and the actions his team took during the investigation, prosecution, and trial give valuable insights into this courtroom battle and what lessons it offers for others prosecuting corruption by police and other officials. This book is available starting today through the Johns Hopkins University Press. We're thrilled to offer you a 30% off discount code to our attendees today. There's a link and the discount code in the chat below. And thank you to all of our online viewers for joining us this afternoon. I encourage you to ask questions throughout the Hopkins at Home Watch Now chat. We will address as many questions as we can during the Q&A portion of the live stream. I would also like to thank our hosts in the Alumni Relations Office, the Office of Lifelong Learning and Hopkins at Home, a digital platform for alumni and the public to experience Hopkins lectures like this virtually. It is now my pleasure to introduce Leo Wise. Leo J. Wise is a federal prosecutor in the U.S. Attorney's Office for the District of Maryland in Baltimore. He graduated from the Johns Hopkins University and Harvard Law School. After law school, he clerked for United States District Court Judge and then joined the U.S. Department of Justice through the Attorney General's Honors Program. At DOJ, Leo served on the tobacco litigation team, the special task force that litigated the federal government's civil racketeering case against the tobacco industry, and the Enron task force, where he was a part of the team that prosecuted Enron's two CEOs, Jeffrey Skilling and Kenneth Lay. In 2007 and 2008, he served as a senior counsel to the Assistant Attorney General in charge of the Criminal Division, with responsibility for advising the AAG on fraud matters. In 2008, Leo was recruited to be the founding staff director and chief counsel for the Office of Congressional Ethics, an independent office within the U.S. House of Representatives that investigates allegations of misconduct against members of the House. In 2010, Leo joined the U.S. Attorney's Office for the District of Maryland, where he prosecuted the mayor of Baltimore, the Baltimore Police Commissioner, an entire unit of the Baltimore Police Department that was robbing civilians, 3 members of Maryland's legislature, and the largest criminal case ever brought in the District of Maryland, an 80-defendant corruption case at a state prison. Leo served as an officer in the United States Navy Reserve and is taught as an adjunct professor at American University. Leo, welcome, and thank you so much for joining us. Tell us about the book and your inspiration to write it.
Thank you, Camille. In talking about the book, I'd like to start, if I could, just with reading 2 passages from the prologue. Members of the jury, have you agreed on your verdict? Karen Moye, the courtroom deputy, asked. Yes, the jurors answered in unison. Who shall speak for you? Our foreperson, again in unison. Juror number 2, a young African-American man, the only one among the 12 jurors, rose to speak. I had watched this scene play out many times before. The identity of the foreperson had never mattered to me. All I had cared about was the verdict. This time was different, though. I'd never had a case like this, and it had never occurred to me that the person a jury chose to speak for them would send a message even before announcing their verdict. It did that day in the winter of 2018. The question Moye asked the jury, who shall speak for you, had never struck me as particularly important before. But as juror number 2 rose to deliver the verdict, the question took on new meaning. Unlike the other members of the jury, juror number 2 looked like the task force's victims and the people who testified against them, young Black men. The jury had chosen him to speak for them. What would he say? I'd like to start just by saying that the views I express are my own and not those of the Department of Justice of the United States government. Who Speaks for You is a book about a case I prosecuted against an entire unit of the Baltimore Police Department called the Gun Trace Task Force, or the task force it's referred to in the passage I just read. What we learned in the course of our investigation was that these police officers had, in a phrase, gone from being cops to robbers. We learned they were robbing civilians, stealing money, drugs that they then sold back onto the street, jewelry, expensive clothing, cologne, watches, anything they could get their hands on. We learned that they planted evidence, lied in search warrants and police reports. We learned that the sergeant in charge of the unit had even caused the death of a man when he engaged in a high-speed chase. And Who Speaks for You is told not in the order of the events that in the order of the events that I described occurred, but rather the way in which the truth unfolded in the investigation, and then how we charged the case and how we ultimately tried it in federal court in Baltimore. In answering your question about my inspiration for the book, I saw it as an extension of my public service, which has been really the animating idea of my career. Because what this case showed was that the criminal justice system can and does work, that the police can be held accountable, which is something that I think is so important, particularly right now. In this case in Baltimore, a jury convicted police officers who were breaking the law. And people in Baltimore knew the story from local coverage, but this was an effort to make the story more widely known. Because at the end of the day, I didn't want to write just another bad cop story. I wanted to write a story about how we searched for and found the truth. And the truth in this case really was a destination that we couldn't see at first. And we didn't even know how we were going to get there. And I say that in part because of the way the case started. And if I could just have the next slide. The case started with a phone call. And I got asked to come to a meeting that I didn't even know what the purpose of it was. And when I got to a conference room in the U.S. Attorney's Office, it was filled with drug investigators, not the kind of cases I handled. And what they described was how they were investigating a drug organization that operated here in Baltimore around the Alameda. And they had a theory, and it was just a theory at first, that this drug organization was able to stay ahead of law enforcement because it had a cop protecting the drug dealer. And so we got a wiretap on the drug dealer's phone, and we put a GPS tracking device on his car. And then we got the first big break in the case. He happened to bring the car into a garage here in Baltimore, and they found the tracker. And when I say it was a breakthrough, it's because of what he did next. He picked up the phone, as you might expect, but who he called was so important. He called a police officer named Mamadou Gondo, and he told him, the thing, it's lit. And we knew what the thing was. We knew that was the GPS device we'd put under the car, and we knew it was lit because it had a red blinking light on it when it operated. And so at that moment, the theory that this drug dealer had a cop helping him became reality. They discussed how to get rid of it and what to do with it. And from there, we were able to then tap the cop's phone, again, operating under the theory that he was helping them stay ahead of law enforcement. And so with a tap on his phone, we listened for evidence that he was helping these drug dealers, and we found it. He even said as much in a boastful call to his girlfriend one night. But we also heard him behaving like we thought a police officer would, making arrests. And one of those arrests stood out, and it stood out because he'd been on the phone the whole time talking to someone, describing what was going on. And we also had seen from video that the city maintains what had gone on. And when we saw the police report that described this event, it was dramatically different from what we knew had happened. And so it posed a question. Had we stumbled into something totally new? Was this case about a cop helping a drug dealer, or was this also a civil rights investigation? Was this cop lying about his arrests to make the evidence, to make them look better, to make the evidence survive suppression hearings? And we didn't know. This was the rare case where most of the cases I prosecute, like the Enron case that you mentioned, the company collapsed. Everybody knew who was in charge, and the question was sort of what had happened and what was their intent. Were these mistakes that were made that caused the company to collapse, or was it something more nefarious? Here, we didn't know what we had stumbled on when we saw this police report that looked nothing like the truth. And so we looked for calls that the person who was arrested might have made from jail, because in Baltimore, when you go to jail, you can make calls and they're recorded. And we found a call where he was talking to his girlfriend and he was trying to make bail, and he was desperate to make bail. And he told her how much money he had in his wallet, and she told him it was empty. And at that moment, the case moved in a completely different direction, because it wasn't a matter just of this police officer helping this drug organization. We had stumbled into the crime that would come to define the case that the book describes, and that is that these police officers had robbed this man. And so we then went and got the arrest records from the officers that had been involved in this arrest and started listening for jail calls made by the people that they had arrested, and heard over and over again people discovering that they had been robbed by the police. And then as 2016 turned from the spring into the summer, we learned that it wasn't only these police officers, these 3 police officers that were involved in this one robbery that were robbing civilians, but it was their entire unit, the whole gun trace task force. And they had been doing it even before they all got together in the gun trace task force. In other words, the task force was sort of a perfect storm of dirty cops. And it wasn't a unit where the officers went rogue. They had all gone rogue already. The themes of the book are first and foremost belief and disbelief. And Who Speaks for You asks the question, who do you believe and why do you believe them? If I could have the next slide. These are the members of the gun trace task force, or some of them. They were featured in an internal Baltimore Police Department newsletter praising their performance not too long before they were all arrested on federal charges. And so in the normal course of events in courtrooms all over the country, everyday police officers like these officers come into court and testify, and they're believed in part because they are police officers. And they testify against people who commit crimes, most commonly drug-related crimes, at least in federal court. And we believe the police officers, and we don't believe people with criminal records, people who've been accused of crimes, and the people that live in and around them. And so what Who Speaks for You talks about is how we came to believe the victims of the task force, drug dealers, people who had been drug dealers, and people who lived in and around them, and came to disbelieve the police. The next theme of the book is that geography is destiny. And if I could have the next slide. This is a map that appears in the book that shows the locations of the robberies we uncovered. And what Who Speaks for You talks about is how much where you're from determines about your life, including your relationship with the police. And in the neighborhood I live in Baltimore, for instance, the chief complaint is that the police aren't there enough. In East and West Baltimore, which is where most of these robberies occurred, the complaint is that this unit of supposedly elite plainclothes officers behaved more like a pack of wolves preying on the communities they were supposed to protect. And on that note, if I could read just one other passage, and this occurs at the very end of the book in the afterword. More than anything else, the case opened my eyes to the reality that people living in East and West Baltimore faced in dealing with the police. For these folks, the police didn't protect them from crime. Instead, they exposed them to daily indignities. Traffic stops for imagined violations, tint violations on cars that didn't have tinted windows, seatbelt violations when the driver was wearing a seatbelt, and searches for no apparent reason. That's what happened to Herbert Tate. Imagine what it would feel like to have another grown man stick his fingers in your mouth or run his hands around your waistband. These things happened repeatedly to Black men in Baltimore. That's why Tate left the city. Who could blame him? And then, of course, our investigation revealed not only bad policing, but much worse, parasitic law-breaking by the police toward the very people they were supposed to be protecting the community from. Drug dealers flushed with cash were supposed to be arrested. Instead, they were robbed and let go. Perhaps what was most shocking was that what we discovered, what seemed so surprising to us, wasn't all that surprising at all. It wasn't a surprise to the people who had to live with it. One day after the trial, I was waiting for the elevator in the lobby of my office building. One of the elevators was out of service. As I stood there, an older black man left the elevator that he was repairing and approached me. I had never met him before. I can only presume he knew who I was from a news story that had my picture in it. "I'm from East Baltimore," he said. We all knew about Herschel. Now I did too. And Herschel was one of the men that went to trial in this case, was one of the men who had robbed people from years before he got together with the other officers. And the third theme of the book, and something that I know we're going to talk more about, is how, in order to catch these men, we had to flip the playbook.
In the book, you describe how federal law enforcement had to build their case in the opposite way that they normally would to convict the cops, using the testimony of the drug dealers. How is the playbook flipped in this case?
So that's just it, right? In our case, the police officer sat at the defense table and came into the courtroom from the holding cells behind the walls every day. And the men that took the stand, and they were almost all men, were the ones with the criminal records. And after they testified, they walked out the front door. And that's what made the case so challenging. It made it challenging to investigate because, and this is part of how we had to flip the playbook, the officers knew how to investigate crime. They were law enforcement like us, and so they knew how to stay ahead of us. And one of the incidents I describe in the book is a tension that was really present throughout was we needed enough evidence to convict them to make the charges stick, but we were worried really from the beginning that somebody could get hurt. For instance, resisting arrest. And we know people resist arrest when they're legitimately being arrested, but here people were being robbed. And so we thought the likelihood that someone might essentially fight back and get hurt or even killed was real. So every day we were worried about that if we let the case go on too long, somebody could get hurt or even killed, and that people were sitting in jail who might otherwise be innocent. And so we planned an operation, which we called the Winnebago Caper, where we rented a Winnebago, made it look like someone had driven around Baltimore selling drugs, had drug paraphernalia, clothes, half-eaten food in it. And we got a judge's permission to put a bug in it that would record what went on. And we put bait money in this Winnebago. And then we had another law enforcement jurisdiction call the task force and tell them they'd arrested someone driving this Winnebago outside of Baltimore City. He was cooperating. The RV was parked at a rest stop in Baltimore. The key was under the bumper, and could they go and secure it so that whatever was inside could be recovered? And what we thought happened was, thinking that no one was watching, if they found the bait money, they would take some or all of it. What we didn't count on was they immediately suspected that this was some kind of law enforcement operation. And we knew this because we had wiretaps on their phones. And so instead of taking the bait, they dispatched another member of the task force to go to a nearby motel. The Winnebago was parked in a motel parking lot to see if they had CCTV cameras, which would have captured the FBI setting the whole thing up. And so thankfully they didn't. And we were able to race to the scene ahead of the task force and move the Winnebago, and then tell them that the person who had put it there admitted he moved it and changed the story such that they didn't suspect what was going on. But that was a great example of how these officers knew how to stay ahead of us, and the case was almost compromised. We had to look for ways, in order to convict them, we had to look for ways to convince the jury that they could believe our victims. And that was also part of flipping the playbook. And the two things that we had going for us that were, I think, the most powerful pieces of corroboration of these victims was that in every case they had made a phone call from jail where they discovered that money was missing. And I had heard from other senior prosecutors in the office where I worked that sometimes people lie on these jail calls and they say, the gun was planted or it wasn't theirs. And that's understandable because they're trying to get their girlfriend or their mother or brother, whomever, to help them. And so someone's a lot more likely to help them if they think they're innocent. But what we were listening for was times when people were trying to make bail, when they had a maximum incentive to tell the truth about how much money they had and where it was. And so for each of the incidents we charged, we used those jail calls almost like time capsules to take the jury and discovered that they had been robbed. And then the other thing we had going for us to convince the jury in this upside down world was the pattern of their robberies. We had, as the map shows, incident after incident around the city involving people who had never met one another, but who told a startlingly similar story about the police coming upon them, finding that they had money, and then taking that money.
Up on the map that you just mentioned, and this is one of the complicated dynamics that you have been talking about. How does your understanding of the inequity of geographic dynamics across Baltimore, i.e. the map, how do they factor into this case?
So they factor in a number of ways, including the question I have on the screen, which is why do we believe people and not why do we believe some people and not believe others? And geography played into this. The robberies almost exclusively happened in East and West Baltimore. And in hyper-segregated Baltimore, these are what are referred to by demographers as the black butterfly. The two wings of the black butterfly are neighborhoods that are overwhelmingly African American. And the white L, sort of the strip down the middle of this map and along the water, where there are no robberies, are largely neighborhoods where Caucasians live. And so the experience of the police was dramatically different in East and West Baltimore as opposed to the spine, if you will, of the butterfly and along the waterfront. And so we had to approach our victims and we had to approach our jury with that in mind. One of the things that, and the jury, I should say, in Baltimore in federal court is drawn from the whole state of Maryland, except the Washington suburbs. So it tends to be much whiter and more suburban than a jury just in the city. So what we had to confront were things like our victims, some of whom were drug dealers, but some of whom weren't, who just happened to get in the crosshairs of the task force because they were in these neighborhoods in East and West Baltimore. Our victims, for instance, had cash on them. One man in particular I described, a man named Herbert Tate, was an HVAC engineer, and he'd just gotten paid when Daniel Herschel set upon him, and he had cash in his pocket that he had gotten from his job, and he paid some bills and had the receipts. But to someone who didn't experience the world the way Herbert Tate did, it might raise the question, and this would include our jurors, why did he have all this cash on him if he had a legitimate job? In my neighborhood in North Baltimore, there's four bank branches on one strip alone. What I came to understand as we drove through East and West Baltimore, looking at the scenes of these robberies, there were no bank branches. There was no place for Herbert Tate to have a bank account. And so that experience of the differences within our city helped inform how we had to investigate the case, who we believed, why we believed them, and then how we had to present it to the jury.
And that's fascinating, thinking about who is on the jury and how we see the world and how we believe what we see. So I want to take that a little bit further and ask you that in the courtrooms in Baltimore and across the country, judges and juries believe the police when they testify against drug dealers. But what you had to do is you had to say, what would it take to believe a drug dealer who claimed he was robbed by the police? And what insights have you gained in this process between what and who we believe and what and who we don't believe?
So, I came to this case with a background not in investigating drug crimes, which is a little unusual. I had spent my whole career doing what's referred to as white collar crimes, sort of economic crimes, public corruption. And so I had never worked with local police officers. In those cases, you really work with the FBI and the IRS, other federal law enforcement. And so I hadn't worked with local police officers, and I also hadn't encountered people like our victims. Instead, my experience had been with people that abused their authority, whether it was business executives or politicians, people that had had all the advantages our society gives someone, and yet had nonetheless chosen to break the law. And in prosecuting people like that, you have to overcome a jury's tendency to really give them a great deal of credit. And that also happens with police officers. So what we had to do was first figure out who we could believe, and then figure out how to bring a jury on that same journey. And those were two, very different tasks. For me, a moment that I describe in the book, when I remember having the visceral feeling that what we were hearing about was real and was really happening, was when we heard from two victims, Herbert Tate, one of whom I mentioned, and then another victim named Antonio Santafel, who had been robbed on back-to-back days in November in the same East Baltimore neighborhood. And they never met one another. They didn't know each other, but they described essentially the same conduct by the police officer that had robbed them. And as we were getting ready to have Santafel testify, he had told us that he worked nights cleaning office buildings. And as we were getting ready to have him testify, I left him in a witness room to wait, and I came back to get him, and he had fallen asleep. And I remember thinking, if this is a man that's about to lie, he wouldn't have fallen asleep. And it wasn't just little tells like that. As I said, it was the pattern we saw of so many people describing what had happened to them in incredibly similar ways. It was those jail calls that they made to their family members, where they were trying to make bail, and in that moment of desperation, when they had all the reason in the world to tell the truth, describing how much they had and how much was missing. And then we also understood that we really had to corroborate these witnesses every way we could. So with things like the wiretap I mentioned, we also bugged Gondo's BPD police car, and were able to record him and other members of the task force as they robbed people and as they planted evidence and committed other crimes. We also pulled in things like the City Watch cameras I mentioned that showed what they were doing on the streets in Baltimore. And then after the police officers were charged, 4 of the 7 agreed to cooperate. And what was so interesting was, when they agreed to cooperate, they not only admitted to the crimes that we had charged them with, the robberies that are depicted on the map, they told us about more. And what that meant was that not a single victim, not one, had lied to us. It was astonishing that not one victim had made up that they'd been robbed. None of these police officers, who had every incentive to tell the truth once they started cooperating, said, I didn't take money from that man, or that he's lying to you. They validated what the victims told us, and then they went further and talked about additional robberies they'd committed. And so the combination of the victims corroborated with all of the evidence we could find that didn't rely on their credibility, wiretaps and recordings, combined with the insiders on the task force that ultimately cooperated, I think presented a picture of really overwhelming evidence. The other thing we did was, at some point, the lead FBI case agent, a woman named Erica Jensen, came to me and said, they've been listening to the police officers looking for evidence of these robberies. They've been listening to the bug, and they've been listening to the wiretaps. But we also heard in the course of that them talking about dropping off their kids at daycare, going to the gym, when they were getting to work, when they were leaving. And Erica, who was such a good investigator, at one point said, these guys aren't working. They're supposed to have a shift from 8 o'clock in the morning till 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and then they can work overtime after that. But they weren't coming in sometimes until after their regular shift ended. And then they were claiming hours more of overtime than they had actually worked. And so what we were able to do with that was charge wire fraud. These men were abusing the time and attendance system at the Baltimore Police Department to make more money than they were entitled to. And to convict them of wire fraud, a jury wouldn't have to believe any of our less than perfect victims, because the evidence that they'd committed fraud was sitting in their pockets. It was their cell phones, which told us where they were all the time. We were able to get data on where they were, and all these police officers lived outside the city of Baltimore, which made it helpful. And so when we compared where they claimed they were working, the overtime slip would say they'd done an arrest at the intersection of this street and that street at such and such a time. When we were able to compare that to where their phones were and see they were miles outside the city at home, found a path to conviction that didn't run through East and West Baltimore or the testimony of our victims, but rather relied on the officers' locations and where they said they were and how that was really a lie.
That's fascinating. And you talk a lot about corruption and abuse of power. So in your view, how could this have happened? What does this case say about the possibility of widespread corruption in the Baltimore Police Department?
So I think the bottom line conclusion we reached was that they weren't supervised, that this unit wasn't supervised, which doesn't sound very sophisticated, but at the end of the day, that's what was going on. Plainclothes units are used in police departments all over the country, and there's arguments that are made for why they're effective. There also, in this case, was clearly an absence of adequate supervision of them. And the fact that they were a plainclothes unit, in other words, not in uniform, we learned complicated things. And I'll mention just one of the ways it did. Victim after victim we talked to said they knew these were police officers. They saw that they had, vests, for instance, over their civilian clothes that said police, but it just said police. They didn't know if they were federal law enforcement. Sometimes these arrests were made outside of the city of Baltimore, so they wouldn't necessarily assume they were the Baltimore Police Department. So the victims didn't know who to call to complain, even if they were inclined to complain. And that actually was something the task force was counting on, that the people they preyed on wouldn't be inclined to complain, because they were robbing drug dealers and they were taking money and drugs. And the logic was, first, who would believe these people? And second, would they really come forward and say, I had more drugs than were recovered, or I had more drug money than what was recovered? And the task force was really banking on that. And so that's another way this happened. They thought their victims wouldn't complain and wouldn't be believed. The possibility of widespread corruption is present in Baltimore and in any other major American city. There is so much money in and around the illicit drug economy that the temptation is enormous. One of the incidents we learned about when we prosecuted the second sergeant in charge of the task force was when he and two other officers went into a house and pulled open the drawer of a bureau, and there was $400,000 in cash in it. And he looked at the other two officers and said, no one's going to miss a stack if we take one. And so that enormous amount of money is there, and it's not going away. And so it has to be taken into account in terms of the way in which the police are supervised, to make sure that people's moral compasses aren't overcome by the sheer amount of money that's involved.
That's fascinating, and I'm really excited to hear what the people who are watching today, what questions they have for you. But as an attorney, just want to pivot for a second, and you're someone who uses words for a living. How did writing your book differ from the writing you do in your career as an attorney? And do you have any advice for any of the aspiring authors that are in the audience today?
Yeah, so one of the things that appealed to me about writing the book was that, in my job as a trial lawyer, I think about narratives and themes all the time, particularly because of the kinds of cases I do. They're not straightforward in the sense that you describe in a chronological way that, someone was found with drugs or found with a weapon, or you have to sort of master the facts and the complexities, and then boil it down to something that's relatively straightforward, because after all, a criminal trial is a morality play. It's not a question of breaking some, technical rule. It's about right and wrong. And so figuring out kind of the story within the story in a complicated fact pattern and figuring out how those facts demonstrate right and wrong is something I do sort of every day. The way my legal writing differed was words really matter, just like they matter in a book, but in a different way. When we draft an indictment, every word can be scrutinized, and there can be challenges to the charges and motions to dismiss the indictment because of the use of a single word or the omission of a single word or the way facts are described. So I came to the project having spent years thinking about words and how we use them, and also in the courtroom thinking about that, because we signal to the jury so much with the words we choose. I remember reading a story once about a minister who said he spent an hour preparing for every minute of his sermon. And I think for trial lawyers, there's a similar relationship of preparation to presentation, where when I give an opening statement to a jury or a closing statement, I think about every word and the signal it sends and how words can have different meanings for different parts, for different parts of the jury. And so I brought all that to bear. What I had never done before was write for a broader audience. I had written for, judges, really. That's who most of the writing we do is for. So the challenge in writing this book was how to write for a broader audience, an audience that wasn't just other lawyers or judges. And what was so interesting about that was that I think my writing got much better. And now I think my legal writing actually is better because I learned, with the help of someone named Lawrence Lanahan, who worked with me at the press, who's an author himself, I learned how to write, I think, more the way I speak, and to write in ways that is more persuasive, shorter sentences, use of dialogue, cutting words you don't need. I think in legal writing, there's a tendency to write long sentences and long paragraphs with lots of clauses, and it seems like that means it's more serious and more formal, and therefore should be taken into account more. But at the end of the day, we're communicating to a judge just like you're communicating to an audience in a book. And so my co-counsel in the case, Derek Hines, he talked about how, in retrospect, he thinks my writing has gotten better, I think, because of this. So for aspiring writers, I would say, if you have something in your life that you think tells a good story, and I'd really always wanted to do this. I'd had other cases, like some of the ones you mentioned in the intro, like the tobacco case, like the Enron case, where I thought there might be a book there. Part of it was just time. I didn't have the time to do it. And the pandemic, when the courts closed, was the first time when I had nights and weekends where I could work on the book. But I also thought this was the most interesting story I could tell. And then the real challenge, and what took a while, was figuring out the story within the story. And I didn't understand that going into this, that I couldn't just write a book about, something happened and then something happened and then something happened. The challenge was really to figure out, again, the story within the story. And that's how I came to the understanding that it wasn't really just a book about bad cops. It was a book about the search for the truth and how we found it. It was a book about belief and disbelief, and how geography was destiny, and how we had to flip the playbook in order to catch these officers. And that took time, figuring out that was really the story within the story. And with the help, as I mentioned, of Lawrence, I was able to do that. And then the opening scene in the book, what I read to you, and the title that I gave the book, it was also a kind of discovery, because I was describing in a meeting with Lawrence this moment when we saw who the jury had picked. And I want to stress that, if it's not clear from the passage I read, the jury chose their foreperson. He wasn't assigned, and they chose someone who looked like the victims in our case to send the message that they believed our victims, like we did, that they had gone on the same journey to the truth that we had. And I got emotional about that moment because it was such a startling revelation. And that's Lawrence said that should be your title. That should be the opening scene, because the jury has chosen that man to speak for them, and he did in a very powerful way.
That is incredibly powerful. Thank you. So now I'd like to open the Q&A portion of the program, and I encourage you to ask questions in the Hopkins at Home Watch Now chat. We're going to do our best to respond to as many questions as we can in the time that we have available. And the first question I'm going to pick here actually follows on the theme you were just talking about, the jury and who speaks for them. So this first question is, can you share more about the challenges and or the process of selecting a jury for this trial and selecting a jury for trials in general?
Sure. So in federal court in Baltimore, as I said, the jury comes from the whole state of Maryland except for the Washington suburbs. So Prince George's and Montgomery County and a couple of counties on the Eastern Shore. So our jurors can come from as far, come from Western Maryland. They can come from the Western Shore. They can come from up on the northern part of the state on the border with Pennsylvania. And so the jury pool tends to be wider and more suburban than a jury pool you would draw in the city. I also describe in the book how Maryland has one of the most, the law that prevents people from serving on a jury is some of the most comprehensive, because not only people that commit felonies can be disqualified from jury service, but people that commit lesser crimes can as well. And so Maryland is sort of an outlier. And so here the challenge was our victims were almost all African American, and our jury we anticipated would be largely white. Our jury would come not from Baltimore, and particularly not from East and West Baltimore, where almost all of the robberies occurred, but from elsewhere in the state, and would have very different views on the police and experiences with the police. I mentioned that none of the police officers in our case lived in the city. Baltimore doesn't have a residency requirement. And so our jurors would have experienced these particular officers, but also police officers in general, more as neighbors or as parents through their schools than they would as our victims had experienced them policing in East and West Baltimore. And so we had to take all of that into account. We also, and this is another way this case sort of flipped the script, typically federal prosecutors in general, look for jurors that might be sympathetic to law enforcement. So they look for people that, if they maybe are in law enforcement themselves, or they're married to someone who is, or they've got law enforcement in their family. And typically the defense will try to exclude those kinds of jurors. Similarly, most of the time prosecutors will be on the lookout for jurors that they think will be sympathetic to people who are charged with a crime. So jurors that may themselves have been arrested, if not convicted, or have family members who've served time in jail. And so in the typical case, the government, the side I'm on, looks for pro-law enforcement jurors and jurors that have not had experiences being charged with crimes or had family members go to jail for having committed crimes. And the defense looks for just the opposite. They want to get pro-law enforcement jurors off the jury, and they're looking for jurors that are sympathetic to people who've been charged with crime. Here it was the inverse. Here we were on the lookout for jurors that might be pro-law enforcement and sought to exclude them, and the defense looked for jurors that were pro-law enforcement and wanted to include them, and similarly with people with criminal records. So it really did sort of turn everything on its head in picking the jury as well as in presenting the case to them ultimately.
That is fascinating. And that's an interesting strategy and techniques you've given us. And I'm going to stay for a minute on the actual prosecution of cases. So one of our listeners wants to know, how does your approach to a case against a public servant change, if at all, versus one against a corporate CEO or C-suite or person that has a substantial amount of power in our society?
So like I said, I've done both kinds of cases, economic crimes and then public corruption cases, including public corruption cases against police officers and correctional officers. You mentioned the case I did at the state prison. There are a lot of similarities. And I say that because unlike most criminal cases, what someone who's in either some kind of public office or a government employee. It doesn't even have to be an elected politician, but a government employee like a police officer or a correctional officer, or someone who's an executive at a company. They come into the courtroom with so many advantages that defendants in other cases, narcotics cases or immigration cases, which are the two sort of most frequently charged crimes in the federal system, but they come into the courtroom with typically, obviously a legitimate job, education, the community trusts police officers. And we see this when we are selecting juries, that one of the questions that are asked is, would you give the testimony of a police officer more weight than the testimony of another witness? And many, many potential jurors say they would. And so whether someone is a public servant or a C-suite type, I think the question asked, they come into the courtroom really a kind of ahead of the game. They don't have a criminal record they can be cross-examined on. In many instances, they weren't arrested at the time of the commission of the crime. As I said, like in the Enron case, the company collapsed and then you figure out what happened. So they don't have a statement that they can be cross-examined with. They can call witnesses, character witnesses, who will talk about what a good character they have for telling the truth or good work they've done in the community. When we were trying the Enron case in Houston, I used to drive by the Ken Lay YMCA in Houston because he'd given it a big donation. And so all of that gives defendants in white collar cases a lot more power than in cases involving drug offenses or immigration offenses or other kinds of offenses that are prosecuted in the federal system. And so the cases are harder, and that has to be taken into account when we're selecting the cases we're going to proceed on, and then in terms of how we present them.
Well, thank you. And we hope that this is a one-off case and something that hasn't proliferated, but it's possible that this sort of thing could be happening elsewhere in various forms. Have any of the strategies developed in your task force, in this task force case and in your department, have they been used in other cases in cities in the United States or abroad, or have you seen any ramifications that have come from the prosecution of this case?
So I've done trainings based on this case to various audiences, both here in the United States, and I've also worked with the American Bar Association for many years training foreign prosecutors and used this as an example. I don't know if those trainings have yielded results, but it's certainly something that we've tried to share and generalize, because I think a number of things that we learned can speak to what's going on in other jurisdictions as well.
Thank you. And now we've had a couple of our watchers here. They've written in, so I'm going to synthesize the questions and pivot to Hollywood a little bit. And everyone would love to hear your thoughts about David Simon's HBO series and the other books on this case, and how this book is in conversation with them, and how you feel about the HBO series, and how this is sort of publicizing Baltimore across the country.
Sure. So I can say a couple of things. So at first I was really nervous about the HBO series because, I'll just speak for myself. I think in my own mind, I'm like better looking than I am. And so I thought I'm going to see when if I'm in it, they're going to cast someone I'm going to be confronted with what I actually look like. So I was nervous, and then when I sort of hoped that they would just focus on the cops and not the sort of boring lawyers, but they didn't. The person that was cast, a terrific actor named Lucas Van Engen, was better looking than me, I'd say, and so that was nice. But he did a great job, and it was a really kind of surreal experience because it's a dramatization. So, I was familiar with documentaries, which sort of attempt to tell the story of what really happened, and I was obviously familiar with fiction, but this was a dramatization, meaning there was someone who had my name and actually kind of looked like me, but doing and saying things that I had never done. And I was actually just really nervous for the most part that I'd come across like a jerk, or that I'd take credit for stuff I hadn't done. And I was pleased that none of that had happened. I thought the series was fascinating, and watched it. And where I think this book differs from the other books and from the series is it really is told from my perspective, and it's told again not in it's not a story about the gun trace task force from its inception to its demise. It's not a story about the Baltimore Police Department in a larger frame. It's really about how the case unfolded for me, I'll say, and I think to a large extent for my co-counsel Derek Hines and the other people on the case. And it's told in how that happened. And I think that's what's so interesting about The Truth, that we didn't know what we had at first, and it was almost like a layering where, one of the early breaks we heard in a wiretap Gondo and Rayam fighting about money, and we didn't know where they were coming from. We didn't know what had happened. So then we tried to figure out, had they just executed a search warrant? We found out they had, but they hadn't arrested anyone. And we had to sort of wait because we figured out whose house it was, but we couldn't go and interview the victims because we thought if that got back to the cops, they would know we were doing the investigation. So we had to sort of wait. We knew something had happened. We knew they were fighting about money. Once we then decided to start interviewing victims, we found the victims. They told us that, yes, they had been arrested. They'd been taken to their house. They had cash there. The police had taken it. They hadn't arrested them. We didn't know who had taken it necessarily, but we had a little bit clearer picture. And then once we brought the charges and some of the officers cooperated, we got sort of the final piece of the puzzle, which is what had gone on when it was just the police officers in the room. And so that's what I try to do. I also try to talk about, how we investigated the case through the use of things like wiretaps and search warrants and what my editor at the press, Matt McAdam, called, New Yorker style asides. That was his phrase. So when I first introduced what a wiretap is, I spent some time talking about how you get one, the sort of the techniques that are used. When I first introduce a search warrant, I talk about how you get one of those and what it means. And so I think in that way, I think the book is different, and I hope complementary to the other stories that have already been told, about this case.
Well, thank you. And in listening to this chat today, I have learned a lot. And what I've picked up on is how much you've thought very deeply about not only this particular case, not only the themes, but sort of the lessons that this holds. And we only have a couple minutes left, but I'm hoping you can talk a bit about the lessons you feel that this book and this case have for our society, for our city, for our state, for our country. What do you hope happens going forward? What do you think are the lessons that we should learn from this?
So I'll mention sort of one micro level lesson, and then I think one macro level lesson. The micro level lesson is how important it is to choose the metrics that measure the police by. And I say that because one of the things we learned is, for this unit, they were measured by how many guns they seized, not how many people they convicted, not how many large-scale violent organizations were dismantled because of their work, but how many guns they seized. And so what developed was a vicious cycle where they used unconstitutional police tactics, things like driving at high speeds towards street corners where there were groups of African-American men. Somebody would run and they'd chase him, tackle him, and search him. And they did that over and over and over again. And eventually they got a gun. If they did it enough times, almost with kind of mathematical certainty, they could get a gun. And then they would use that gun seizure to justify their overtime, regardless of how long they'd actually worked. If they got 3 guns in 3 hours or 3 guns in an hour, they'd claim to work 6 hours or 8 hours. And so that cycle fed itself, that the incentivizing them to seize guns, providing them overtime, really without question, fueled the negative, fueled the unconstitutional police tactics. That's the kind of granular takeaway we had. The big picture takeaway, and where I guess I'd like to end, is that I think what the case speaks to is sort of what I started with, and that is that the system can and does work. And something my co-counsel Derek Hines said in closing really speaks to this. The case stood for the proposition that no one is above the law, and that refers to the police officers, but it also stands for the proposition that no one is beneath the law. And the victims, the people they preyed upon, even if they had criminal records, even if they were people who had been engaged in crimes or around people who had been engaged in crimes, deserved the same protection of the law that all of us enjoyed. And if they didn't enjoy that protection, this is what can happen.
Thank you. And sadly, I really enjoyed this conversation. That's not the sadly part, but I very much enjoyed this conversation. But sadly, it looks that we've run out of time. We're getting close to the top of the hour. So I would like to once again congratulate and thank you, Leo, thank you for the book. Congratulations on its publication. And we want to thank you for generously sharing your time today to discuss the important work that you've done in your career. I'd also like to thank all of our attendees for joining us and encourage all of you to purchase Leo's book, Who Speaks for You? The Inside Story of the Prosecutor Who Took Down Baltimore's Most Crooked Cops. That's starting today, available from the JHU Press. We're providing a link to purchase the book with a special promotional code for 30% off to our viewers. It's in the chat. In addition, a follow-up email will be shared with all of our viewers that will include a recording of the program and a link to our upcoming event schedule. We hope to see you soon at future Hopkins Alumni in Law, HAIL, and Hopkins at Home events. You can always find and register for upcoming programs at events.jhu.edu. So from these fellow Blue Jays, we want to say thank you. We hope you enjoyed this, and we hope you have a great afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you.